The night security guard at Mercy General Hospital in San Antonio was just another invisible face in scrubs to most people. Maria Santos had been walking these halls for 2 years, checking doors and monitoring cameras while doctors and nurses barely acknowledged her existence. But hidden beneath the surface of this quiet woman in a security uniform was a truth so explosive that it would soon have the FBI director personally flying to Texas, and enemies who thought she was dead scrambling to finish what they'd started 8 years ago. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital's East Wing hummed their familiar tune as Maria Santos completed her 2 a.m. rounds. At 34, she moved through the corridors with the measured pace of someone who understood that vigilance was survival, scanning every shadow, noting every detail, maintaining the kind of awareness that most people never needed to develop. Dr. Richard Castellanos barely looked up from his tablet as she passed the cardiac unit. To him, she was just another piece of hospital infrastructure, necessary but forgettable, like the janitors or the food service workers. The night shift security guard with the slight accent and the too quiet demeanor who always seemed to be exactly where she was supposed to be, exactly when she was supposed to be there. "Evening, Dr. Castellanos," Maria said softly, her voice carrying just enough respect to satisfy protocol without demanding attention. He grunted in response, his focus remaining on the patient charts that consumed his nights. Castellanos was chief of cardiology, a position that demanded perfection and rewarded arrogance. He built his reputation on split-second decisions and surgical precision, but he'd also built walls around himself that made him blind to the people who kept his world functioning. What Castellanos didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Maria Santos wasn't really a security guard. She wasn't even really Maria Santos. The woman checking locks and monitoring cameras had once been Staff Sergeant Carmen Vega, one of the military's most skilled combat medics, whose hands had saved more lives in Afghanistan than most doctors saved in their entire careers. 8 years ago, Carmen Vega had died in an IED explosion outside Kandahar. Officially, the funeral had been held, the flag presented to her sister, the headstone placed in Arlington National Cemetery. But the woman buried there was someone else, a Jane Doe whose identity had been carefully substituted to protect a soldier whose knowledge had become too dangerous to acknowledge. Because Carmen Vega hadn't just been a medic, she'd been part of a classified medical research program that developed trauma treatment techniques, so advanced they bordered on miraculous. Her unit had achieved survival rates that defied medical understanding, using experimental procedures that could revolutionize emergency medicine, if they ever became public. The problem was that those same techniques could be weaponized. In the wrong hands, the knowledge of human physiology that Carmen possessed could be used to inflict precisely calibrated torture, to keep victims alive during extended interrogations, to cause maximum suffering while avoiding accidental death. When her unit was betrayed by compromised intelligence, the enemy didn't just want to kill Carmen Vega. They wanted to capture her, to extract every detail of the experimental medical procedures she'd helped develop. The explosion that killed her had been a carefully orchestrated extraction, designed to get her out of Afghanistan before she could be taken alive. Maria Santos had been born in a military hospital in Germany, complete with forged records that showed 2 years of civilian security training and an unremarkable employment history. She'd been given a small apartment in San Antonio, a job at Mercy General, and strict instructions to maintain the lowest possible profile while government scientists worked to declassify her medical knowledge. But declassification was a slow process, and enemies had long memories. Dr. Castellanos had no idea that the security guard he barely noticed possessed medical skills that surpassed his own. When he struggled with a difficult diagnosis, Maria often knew the answer before he did. When he lost a patient to complications, she understood exactly what had gone wrong and how it could have been prevented. But she stayed silent, invisible, safe. The harassment started small, as it always did. "Santos," Castellanos called out during one of his late-night rounds, his voice carrying the particular tone that people used when they wanted to remind someone of their place in the hierarchy. "Why is this door unlocked?" Maria approached the supply closet he was indicating, noting immediately that the lock showed signs of recent tampering. "Sir, this door was locked when I checked it 30 minutes ago. Someone's forced it." "I don't care what you think you checked," Castellanos snapped, his exhaustion from a 16-hour shift bleeding into anger. "Your job is to keep things secure. If you can't handle something as simple as checking locks, maybe you should consider a different career. The accusation stung, but Maria's response was measured, professional. I'll file a report about the forced entry, Dr. Castellanos. Hospital security should be aware that someone's breaking into supply areas. You'll file a report about your failure to do your job properly, he corrected, his tone growing harsher. I'm tired of these excuses. Every shift there's something. A door that wasn't checked, an area that wasn't secured. It's clear that affirmative action hiring has lowered our standards to the point where patient safety is compromised. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Maria felt the familiar burn of rage building in her chest, the same fury that had once driven her to work 18-hour shifts in trauma tents, to refuse evacuation when her unit was under fire, to perfect medical techniques that could snatch lives back from death itself. But Carmen Vega would have fought back. Maria Santos had to stay quiet. What Castellanos didn't understand was that his criticisms revealed more about him than about her. The forced lock he blamed her for was actually evidence of a growing security threat that Maria had been tracking for weeks. Medical supplies were disappearing, drug inventories weren't matching records, and access logs showed irregularities that suggested someone with inside knowledge was systematically compromising hospital security. Maria had been building a case, documenting the evidence with the same methodical precision she'd once used to track enemy movement patterns in Afghanistan. But she couldn't report it through normal channels without revealing the depth of her investigative skills, the military-trained pattern recognition that would raise questions about her background. So she watched, and waited, and prepared for the threat she could sense approaching like a storm on the horizon. The escalation followed a predictable pattern. Castellanos began questioning Maria's competence in front of other staff members, suggesting that her security checks were inadequate, that her reports were unreliable, that her presence represented a liability to patient safety. I don't understand why administration hired someone so clearly unqualified, he confided to nurse practitioner Jennifer Walsh during one of their late-night consultations. Santos can barely speak English properly, and her security procedures are amateur at best. Last week, she claimed someone had broken into supply storage. More likely she forgot to lock it properly and needs someone to blame. Walsh, a 20-year veteran of emergency medicine who'd worked with security personnel from every background imaginable, found Castellanos' assessment troubling. Maria seems competent to me, Richard. Her reports are detailed, her rounds are thorough, and she's always professional. Professional? Castellanos laughed bitterly. She's going through the motions without understanding the substance. Diversity hiring has given us a security guard who learned her skills from a YouTube video. It's only a matter of time before her incompetence costs someone their life. What neither of them knew was that Maria was monitoring their conversation through the hospital's security system, her trained ear picking up details that revealed far more than Castellanos intended. His criticisms weren't just personal, they were strategic, designed to undermine her credibility before she could report the security breaches she'd been documenting. Because Dr. Richard Castellanos wasn't just an arrogant physician frustrated by long hours and difficult cases. He was also the inside connection for a medical supply theft ring that had been operating throughout South Texas, using his access and credentials to steal experimental drugs that could be sold to the highest bidder. And Maria Santos, with her obsessive attention to security details, was getting too close to evidence that could expose the entire operation. The decision to eliminate the inconvenient security guard had been made weeks ago. The challenge was making her disappearance look accidental, routine, unremarkable. A security guard who suffered a medical emergency during her shift, perhaps a heart attack or stroke that left no evidence of foul play. What Castellanos and his associates didn't know was that their communications had been monitored by federal agencies tracking medical supply theft across multiple states. The DEA, FBI, and military intelligence had been building a case against the theft ring for months, following a trail of stolen experimental drugs that led back to classified military research programs. And when Maria Santos' name appeared in intercepted communications as a target for elimination, facial recognition software had identified her as someone who officially didn't exist, someone whose death 8 years ago had been carefully staged to protect national security interests. The emergency alert came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, crackling through secure channels with the urgency of a national security crisis. Code Black, Code Black. Asset Phoenix is compromised. Repeat, Asset Phoenix is compromised. Immediate extraction authorized. At Mercy General Hospital, Maria Santos was completing her hourly rounds when she noticed the first sign of trouble. A maintenance worker she didn't recognize, accessing areas that should have been locked at this hour. Her military training kicked in immediately, the pattern recognition systems that had kept her alive in Afghanistan identifying threat indicators that civilian security training would have missed. The man's movements were too purposeful, too familiar with the hospital layout. His maintenance uniform was too new, too clean for someone actually doing maintenance work. And the bulge under his jacket suggested equipment that had nothing to do with hospital repairs. Maria activated her radio with carefully controlled comm. Control, this is Santos. I have an unidentified maintenance worker in the East Wing. Can you verify authorization for overnight maintenance in this area? The response came back negative. No maintenance was scheduled. No one should have access to those areas at this hour. But by then, the man had disappeared into the network of corridors that Maria knew better than anyone else in the hospital. She'd spent 2 years learning every entrance, every exit, every hiding place, every vulnerability. If someone was in the hospital illegally, she would find them. What she found instead was Dr. Castellanos, waiting for her in the cardiac unit with a syringe that contained something other than medicine. Evening, Maria, he said, his voice carrying a coldness she'd never heard before. I think it's time we had a conversation about your future employment here. Maria's hand moved instinctively toward the radio at her belt, but Castellanos shook his head. I wouldn't recommend that. You see, I know exactly who you are, Sergeant Vega. Or should I say, who you used to be before your unfortunate death in Afghanistan. The use of her real name hit Maria like a physical blow. 8 years of careful cover, blown by a man who should have had no way to access classified military records. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Of course you do, Castellanos replied, stepping closer with the syringe held at the ready. Combat medic, experimental trauma treatment program, officially deceased but unofficially very much alive. My associates have been looking for someone with your particular skills for quite some time. The realization hit her with devastating clarity. This wasn't just about medical supply theft. It was about her knowledge, the classified medical techniques that could be worth millions to the right buyers. Castellanos hadn't been trying to get rid of an inconvenient security guard. He'd been positioning himself to capture a valuable asset. The beauty of this approach, Castellanos continued, is that Maria Santos will simply disappear. No body to find, no questions to ask. Just another undocumented worker who decided to move on without notice. But what Castellanos didn't know was that Maria Santos had never really been unarmed. The security equipment she carried included items that weren't standard issue, modifications that turned everyday tools into defensive weapons. And Carmen Vega's combat training didn't disappear just because she wore a different name. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Castellanos had expected to subdue a frightened security guard. Instead, he found himself facing a highly trained military veteran whose survival instincts had been honed in the deadliest combat zones on Earth. The syringe went flying, its contents spilling harmlessly across the hospital floor. Castellanos found himself pinned against the wall by someone whose gentle demeanor had concealed the capacity for precisely applied violence. Hospital security to cardiac unit, Maria spoke into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. I have a situation that requires immediate law enforcement response. But the situation was far from over. The maintenance worker she'd spotted earlier was part of a team, and Castellanos' attempt to capture her had been just the opening move in a more complex operation. The hospital's lights went out at 3:34 a.m., plunging the cardiac unit into emergency, lighting that cast everything in red shadows. Maria's military training took over completely, transforming the familiar corridors into a battlefield where every corner could hide an enemy. She moved through the darkness with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned urban combat in Afghanistan's most dangerous cities. The hospital's layout, which she'd memorized for security purposes, became a tactical advantage as she worked to stay ahead of pursuers who knew she was armed with knowledge worth killing for. The radio crackled with communications that revealed the true scope of the threat. Federal agents were converging on the hospital, but the assault team inside was moving to complete their mission before law enforcement could arrive. "Target is mobile in the East Wing," a voice reported in accented English. "Medical extraction is priority. Lethal force authorized if capture is not possible." Maria understood the implications immediately. They didn't just want to kidnap her. They were prepared to dissect her knowledge through torture, to extract every detail of the classified medical procedures she'd helped develop. But Carmen Vega hadn't survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by accepting defeat. She'd survived by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than the enemies who wanted her dead. The counterattack began in the hospital's pharmaceutical storage area, where Maria used her knowledge of medical supplies to create improvised weapons and defensive tools. The same understanding of human physiology that made her a gifted medic also made her capable of precisely targeted violence that could disable without killing. One by one, she neutralized the assault team members who were hunting her through the hospital corridors. Not through brutal force, but through clinical precision, pressure point applications that caused unconsciousness, joint manipulations that prevented resistance, medical knowledge weaponized in service of survival. By the time federal agents stormed the building, they found Maria Santos sitting calmly in the hospital security office, surrounded by unconscious attackers who would wake up with headaches, but no permanent damage. "Sergeant Vega," the FBI team leader said, using her real name for the first time in 8 years. "We're here to take you home." The debriefing took place in a secure facility outside San Antonio, where Maria found herself facing officials who represented every agency that had been involved in her original disappearance. The story they told revealed the true scope of the threat she'd been hiding from, and the reasons her knowledge had been considered too dangerous to acknowledge. "The medical techniques you helped develop in Afghanistan," FBI Director Sarah Chen explained, "represent advances in trauma treatment that could revolutionize emergency medicine. But they also represent capabilities that certain foreign governments would pay enormous sums to acquire." Carmen, sat quietly as the implications became clear. Her knowledge wasn't just valuable for saving lives. It could be used to keep prisoners alive during extended interrogations, to inflict precisely calibrated suffering, to turn medical expertise into an instrument of torture. Dr. Castellanos was working for a network that specializes in acquiring and selling classified medical knowledge, Chen continued. "They've been targeting former military medical personnel for months, looking for someone with your specific expertise. The choice now was the same one she'd faced 8 years ago: remain officially dead and live in hiding, or return to active service with full military protection. But this time, Carmen Vega was tired of hiding. "I want to go back to work," she said quietly. "Real work. Not hiding in a security uniform, but using my skills where they're needed most." Director Chin nodded. "The Army has been developing a new military medical research program. Advanced trauma treatment, civilian emergency medicine integration, next-generation life-saving techniques. They need someone with your background to lead it." The transformation from Maria Santos back to Major Carmen Vega took place over several weeks of careful planning. Her death was officially reversed through classified military channels, her service record updated to reflect her years of protective hiding, her medical knowledge finally allowed to serve its intended purpose. Dr. Castellanos, facing federal charges for medical supply theft and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, found himself in a position to understand the true scope of his miscalculation. The security guard he dismissed and targeted had been one of the military's most valuable medical assets, a soldier whose expertise could have saved thousands of lives if he hadn't forced her back into hiding. 6 months later, Major Carmen Vega stood before a classroom of military medical personnel at Fort Sam Houston, her uniform bearing the insignia of rank she'd never expected to wear again. The Advanced Military Medicine Program had become the Army's premier training facility for emergency trauma specialists, and Carmen had become its most respected instructor. "The enemy's advantage is time," she told her students, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned every lesson through blood and experience. "In combat medicine, every second counts. Every decision matters. Every technique you master could be the difference between a soldier coming home or a family receiving a folded flag." In the front row, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now Major Walsh, having transferred from civilian medicine to military service, took careful notes. The night shift nurse, who defended Maria Santos to Dr. Castellanos, had become one of Carmen's most dedicated students, drawn to the program by respect for someone who'd hidden her expertise for 8 years rather than compromise national security. After class, Carmen walked across the base toward her new quarters, the Texas sunset painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. Her transformation from hidden security guard to visible leader had been challenging, but it felt like coming home after a long exile. "Major," Walsh called out, jogging to catch up with her. "I wanted to thank you for the recommendation that got me into this program. Working with you has been the highlight of my medical career." Carmen paused, studying the woman who'd been one of the few people to recognize her competence when everyone else saw only a security guard. "You earned that spot through your own skills, Jennifer. I just made sure the right people knew what those skills were worth." They walked together in comfortable silence, two medical professionals bound by shared commitment to saving lives. The program they were building together would train the next generation of military medics, turning the hard-won lessons of Afghanistan into protection for future soldiers. But their conversation was interrupted by an urgent radio transmission that sent both women running toward the base medical facility. "Mass casualty event. Highway overpass collapse. Multiple civilian casualties inbound. All available medical personnel report immediately." The emergency was real, immediate, and exactly the kind of challenge that Carmen's program had been designed to address. As she ran toward the medical facility, her training kicked in automatically. The same instincts that had kept soldiers alive in Afghanistan now focused on saving civilian lives in Texas. For the next 18 hours, Major Carmen Vega and her team worked miracles. Using the advanced trauma treatment techniques she developed in combat, they achieved survival rates that defied medical expectations. Patients who should have died were stabilized, families who should have lost loved ones were reunited, and the impossible became routine through the application of knowledge that had been hiding in plain sight for 8 years. The media coverage of the rescue operation mentioned the heroic efforts of military medical personnel, but Carmen's name was carefully omitted from all reports. Some secrets needed to remain secret, even when they saved lives. But within medical circles, word spread quickly about the military program that had achieved miraculous results during the highway collapse emergency. Civilian hospitals began requesting training partnerships, medical schools sought to incorporate military techniques into their curricula, and emergency response agencies lobbied for access to the advanced trauma treatment protocols. Carmen found herself once again at the center of a transformation that would reshape emergency medicine, but this time, she wouldn't be hiding from the recognition. 2 years after her return to active duty, Colonel Carmen Vega had become a legend within military medical circles. Not for hiding, but for standing and teaching. The advanced military medicine program had trained hundreds of medics, prevented countless deaths, and developed techniques that were saving lives across multiple theaters of operation. The memorial wall in her office bore the names of soldiers whose lives had been saved by the program, medics who'd used her techniques to stabilize patients under fire, doctors who'd applied her protocols during mass casualty events, nurses who'd incorporated her training into civilian emergency medicine. But it also bore another name, Maria Santos. The identity she'd worn for 8 years, the security guard who'd been invisible to everyone except the enemies who'd never stopped hunting her. Because sometimes the best way to honor your past is to build a future that makes the sacrifice worthwhile. Sometimes the greatest service comes not from hiding your light under a bushel, but from standing in the spotlight and showing others how to shine. Carmen Vega had finally found her way home. Not to a place, but to a purpose. Not to safety, but to service. Not to the shadows where she'd hidden, but to the light where she belonged. The work continued. The mission endured. And somewhere in the darkness, other enemies were learning that the ghost medic was a ghost no longer. She was a leader, a teacher, a healer whose influence extended far beyond the reach of their hatred. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she'd ever wanted her service to mean. The story of Maria Santos had ended. The legend of Colonel Carmen Vega was just beginning.